I think that I find when people come to me when they're suffering intolerably, which is one of the criteria to be eligible for an assisted death, and really want me to help them to find a way to comfortably end their life with dignity for them. For me to be able to play a role there, to help them discover what it is that they need, what they can still access, what they can't, what they need for the end of their life, how they want to interact with their family, how they can fulfill their final bucket list things that need to be done, to facilitate that for them, and then to really help choreograph and organize that final moment for them. When I leave their home, when I leave them after that's finished, I'm sad that their life has ended, but I really feel like I have facilitated their final wishes.
Hello, beautiful people. On today's podcast, we have the wonderful Dr. Stefanie Green. Dr. Green is a pioneer in medically assisted dying who helps patients who are suffering to explore and then fulfill their end-of-life choices. She is the author of the new book, Assisted, a doctor's story of assisting death and embracing life. What I personally love about this conversation is Dr. Green's openness and vulnerability in the context of being a physician who administers assisted dying. It indeed is a tender space in which she offers insight into quote-unquote extraordinary moments that are shared with both patients and families before the administration. We speak about very intimate moments for Dr. Green that inspire her to reflect on what is important in life, particularly around the concepts of presence and meaning, and also in the realm of being able to say sorry and forgive. And we also discuss the controversy around physicians such as Dr. Green, who truly believe that this is a role of service, of giving and not that of taking. Please enjoy this conversation with the lovely Dr. Stefanie Green. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Green.
Thanks for having me.
So Dr. Green, where I'd love to start is with a quote of yours that I heard on a recent interview that you did. For me, it sounds paradoxical, but assisted dying seems to be about death and dying, but it's really a lot about living and how you want to live. Can you please share, Dr. Green, more about what you meant by that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I've really come to believe that through this work. But when I interact with patients primarily at the end of their life who are asking me to help them to end their life. And for much of the time, they tell me it's not that they want to die, it's that they're not living what they believe is their life, that they no longer believe they're contributing, and they feel like their life has ended, they're existing more than living. And when we explore what it is that I can offer them, and when I finally get to the place of telling them that they're eligible for this care, I find that people really grab onto the time they have left, that they now know is finite, which we always know is finite, but for them, they really concretely know it's finite. And they stop worrying about death or dying or what that's going to be like, and they really live with intention. They live with purpose and intention for that time that they have left. And it's about finding what's meaningful for them during that time. It's part of the conversation we have about what's brought them to this point, what has been meaningful in their life, what brings meaning to their life, what brings joy to their life, what they've lost, why they're asking for this. And now with that concrete limited time left, how they want to spend it. So it's a lot about living and how they want to live, not so much about dying.
And I know that you share that, in your own opinion, your own experience, this is certainly a role of service and it's a role of helping, and you yourself derive quite profound meaning from this. Can you share more about how you do develop that profound meaning from such a role?
Sure. So I didn't really expect that going into this work. I mean, I think I do feel quite privileged to be a clinician. I think people have come to me throughout my career at various stages in their lives and have shared things with me that are, personal and sometimes difficult. And so I've always found myself in that privileged position. And I think that I find when people come to me when they're suffering intolerably, which is one of the criteria to be eligible for an assisted death, and really want me to help them to find a way to comfortably end their life with dignity for them. For me to be able to play a role there, to help them discover what it is that they need, what they can still access, what they can't, what they need for the end of their life, how they want to interact with their family, how they can fulfill their final bucket list things of, that need to be done, to facilitate that for them, and then to really help choreograph and organize that final moment for them. When I leave their home, when I leave them after that's finished, I'm sad that their life has ended, but I really feel like I have facilitated their final wishes. I feel like I've been able to give them that, almost like I've given them this gift. It's like their final request. And that makes me feel good. That makes me feel like I've done something good for someone. And I find real meaning in that. I find profound meaning in that. And families and patients have been really grateful for that. And that inspires me.
And what do you think, I'll put these in quotes, miscommunication is between someone like you that's in this role and almost feels this element of giving, and for potentially people that feel sort of different opinions of you, that you're essentially doing something that's taking?
Right. It's almost hard for me to get into that mindset, to understand it, to be honest, because I feel like as a physician, I feel like different people become physicians for different reasons, but ultimately, when you distill it down, I really believe that the vast majority of clinicians go into this work because they want to help people. We do that in different ways. Some people do it by cutting, some people do it by medicating, some people do it by counseling, but ultimately we're all striving to help people. And I have often heard people say, but physicians are meant to extend life, to save life, not to take life. And so it kind of reminds me of what you're asking. But I don't see that. I see my role primarily as to help people. And whether it's by birthing them or helping them through a midlife crisis, or whatever they need in adolescence, or helping them through the dying process and dying, I feel like I'm helping. I don't think I'm taking anything away. I think I'm fulfilling my role as a caregiver, as a clinician. So I guess it's a philosophical difference. I almost don't understand the other. I mean, I do superficially, but I think if you really dig into what it is that I do, I can only see it that way.
And earlier you mentioned, as part of the criteria for legally assisted dying, you have to be suffering intolerably. What is the definition of suffering? Is it purely physical? Does mental come into it? I remember even listening to a recent interview, you were speaking with someone that said that even sort of in the upcoming future, mental illness sort of might be sort of brought into this element of assisted dying. Can you share sort of the difficulties in being able to define something as intolerably suffering?
Yeah, suffering is a really important concept in my work. I spend a lot of time thinking about it and trying to kind of dig around the concept, because not only is it an eligibility criteria, but it's a large part of my conversations with patients. So suffering, for sure, I mean, to be explicit in Canadian law anyways, suffering is recognized in our federal law as being either physical, or it could be emotional or psychological. And there's lots of research to show that psychological and emotional suffering are just as profound, or even worse sometimes in terms of experience than physical suffering. So I'm glad to see that the Canadian law has recognized that. And when I speak to people, they don't need to be suffering from physical pain. It could be an emotional suffering that's allowable. I talk a little bit in my book about the difference between pain and suffering, and I think it's an important, because suffering is such a personal concept. And so I want people to understand, if I walk into a room and pinch two different people with the same pinch, they're both going to feel a kind of almost an objective amount of pain. They're both going to feel pain. The first person might think that I'm crazy, crackers, kind of foolish, don't know why I pinched them, brush me off and go on with their day. The second person might become very anxious that I've done this, and fear that I'm going to come back and do it again, and maybe bring an instrument, and maybe draw blood, and maybe torment them. So they're each experiencing the same pain, but they're definitely having different levels of suffering. Suffering is dependent on our own experiences, our history, our experiences, what we've lived through in life, and how we sense our experiences. So suffering is very, very personal. So when I explore suffering with my patients, it's not for me to say, whether they're suffering or not. It's for the patient to explain to me whether they are or they're not, and why, and how so, and what contributes to that. And then it's for me to help explore how we might be able to reduce that suffering in other ways, other than an assisted death. Are there resources I can offer you? So digging into what's causing someone's suffering and how I might be able to alleviate that is a large and important part of what I do. But it is really, really personal. And so it's a big concept. The idea you mentioned, the idea of mental health patients, it's related but a little bit different. Canadian law is in the midst of a change. We will be allowing patients whose sole underlying condition is a mental health disorder to have access to MAID in March of 2023, and we will be spending a lot of time between now and then trying to figure out how we might do that in a safe way with extra safeguards. But the recognition that mental health patients may be suffering intolerably is certainly part of that discussion.
And how do you personally deal with the complexities of something like this? You have the law on one hand and then sort of the interpretation of the law on the other, and having to bring that into your work. Is it something that you find is easy to establish with each individual person, or does it sometimes take quite a lot of sort of like understanding and knowledge and sort of back and forth between other people to truly understand whether, each individual person is worthy of this criteria to be able to be legally assisted in dying?
Yeah, it was really, really tricky, especially at the beginning. I mean, it's never easy, and there's certainly cases that are complex. Every situation I find myself in is unique. There's no doubt, and it's not just a cliche to say that. Every person is unique. Every situation is unique. Everyone's coming to me for help is unique in some way. So it's never straightforward. It's always worthy of real contemplation. I think in the first 6 to 12 months, it was especially difficult. There was this new law. I'm not a legal scholar. I didn't really know what the law meant. I wasn't really equipped to interpret the law, but it was my role to determine whether a patient met the criteria without actually being responsible for interpreting that criteria. It's kind of a weird difference, but an important one. So how do I do that? Well, it wasn't that clear in the beginning how to do that. We didn't have a lot of guidance. We needed to speak to colleagues in other countries who had experience with certain criteria and how they did that, and learn from them clinically how to maybe interpret and clinically, interpret these kinds of phrases, and consult with legal scholars and other colleagues across the country. How are you doing it? What does this mean? To debate this, to explore it, to learn, and our understanding matured over the years. In the first 6 months, I might have responded in a much more cautious way. I'd like to think I'm still cautious, but, I'm much more clear on what things mean now and how to interpret that. So, the value of having colleagues that I work with closely from across the country. There's not that many of us, but we're connected together through our organization, and we consistently, on a daily basis, we connect with each other, we communicate with each other, we learn from each other. It's just a bedrock of what I need to do this work, for sure. Yeah.
And you mentioned other countries, and obviously in other countries, they have different ways of sort of doing similar things. You mentioned in your book, Assisted, you speak about having two options of physician-assisted dying and also self-administered. And in your book, you share that most people, when given the option, would prefer to have physician-administered assisted dying. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so in Canada, we have both options available, and the vast majority, more than 99%, have chosen clinician-administered assisted death. In the United States and many other jurisdictions in the world, there's only self-administration. So it's there's only 4 jurisdictions in the world that I'm aware of where clinicians are allowed to do this: in Canada, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And everywhere else, it's self-administered only. But in all of those jurisdictions where there is that option, the very vast majority of patients have chosen clinician-administered death. So why is that, you ask? It's a good question. I don't have hard evidence for that, but I can tell you that there's a certain comfort level in having a professional be involved in this care. I think people are worried that they might get it wrong or not do it well or do it properly enough if they're left in charge of it themselves. I think that in many jurisdictions where it's only self-administered, as it is in Australia, there's many regulations, and one of them is that the patient is at end of life, that they have a terminal diagnosis, that they're dying within 6 months. And I think many of those patients, so it's quite limited in that sense, but many of those patients are unable, physically to sit up, to hold a glass, to drink and
Right.
swallow and use a digestive system that works. Some patients will be excluded from care because they simply are too sick to take advantage of that. And so in Canada, we can help people, a wider variety of people. So some people at that stage simply prefer and obviously choose to have a clinician help them because they can't do it themselves. They're unable to for whatever reason. So I think that's important. So I think, security factor, disability, in its truest sense of the word is an issue for sure. Also, the medications that are used by clinicians are intravenous. They are 100% effective if we are in the vein. There is a time-limited event that's very controlled. I think patients appreciate that. The self-administered drinks, there's a variety of, I'll say, recipes out there, not all of which are as successful as others. There's a lot of uncertainty and side effects that can come into it. So, they're a bit messier in that sense, longer times, unpredictable. There's a number of reasons I think clinician-administered death is preferred.
And in your book, Assisted, one of the first stories you share is of the first time that you were in this role. And you mention the name in the book is a man called Harvey. What was that like, having your first experience being in the role of administering something that essentially has a life pass?
Yeah. It's hard to put into a couple words. I would say the word that comes to mind is extraordinary. It was an extraordinary experience for me. It was such an intimate experience. I have to say, I'm as I describe in the book, Harvey and his family, I feel very lucky that they were my first patients. Harvey was very set. He knew exactly what he wanted. He has lots of rationale. I don't have to tell his entire story here for you, but a self-made man who wanted very much some control at a known end of life. His family was incredibly supportive in the face of an unknown procedure. And I knew that my role was to be there to guide them, to help them through this, to be the kind of the knowing clinician in the room, making sure it was happening. And at the same time, of course, I was, a little fearful. I'd never done this before. I'd never been able to do that. But the intimacy of that time with that family, when we finally got into the room, and it was just Harvey and his two children, grown children, and his wife, and there was this instinct, like it's almost like they were teaching me. Instinctively, they all reached out. They all wanted to be touching Harvey. The two children reached out. They were touching him in various places. The wife was pulled up to the side. She was leaning in, holding his face, stroking him, and forehead to forehead, whispering to each other. She was saying goodbye. He was saying goodbye. It was mesmerizing. It was almost distracting from what I was doing. I was so caught up in the moment and watching them kind of school me in how this could be. I wasn't the one teaching them. They were definitely teaching me in that paradoxically beautiful moment when this terrible tragedy was coming to the end of his life, and there was this beautiful giving and loving that was happening. It was really extraordinary. I mean, that's the best word I can tell you. And then surprising, because when it was over, I did my job. I got myself back into role. I did my job. I was quite overwhelmed by their immediate reaction to me. I was a little unsure how they would react, and they were immediately grateful and hugged me. And, I was just, I was a little overwhelmed with the whole event. Yeah.
Beautiful. And you say that you were lucky, and I've also heard you say that you were grateful for having Harvey and his family be within that first experience. Do you feel like if you had a different experience for the first time, if it didn't go as well as it did, that would have changed your outlook or even your motivation for doing what you continue to do today?
I think it's possible. I think I do think it's possible. I think, at the very beginning, there were no mentors, there were no preceptors, there's no one to
Right.
teach me, to guide me. And so I had, my little group of 4 people, and we were helping each other. And I'd like to think that they would have supported me through a less than wonderful experience, and maybe I would have persevered. I think it's so important today as we teach new clinicians and clinicians who are coming to this work to really mentor them, to bring them along so they can witness one or two, so they can, dip their toe in and see how that feels and talk about how that feels, and, make sure this is, they're willing to do this and what it's like and express that. I think that mentorship is so important. And I do think it's a risk at the beginning. I didn't have all of that, and it could have gone a different way. I do think, though, that one of the central pillars of my teaching in medicine, and I like to think in how I've practiced, for over 2 decades, is that patient-centered care is so important to me in what I do. I really believe that knowledge is power. I believe that patients know themselves best, better than I know them. They know their context, their community. They know what's the right choice for them. And I think I've always respected that. Even if I disagree with it personally, I've tried to be respectful of that. And so I do think that this kind of care would have called to me anyways, and I like to think I would have persisted through a less than wonderful experience, but I remain grateful for that positive first experience for sure. I'd like, not every death is like Harvey's, but I have to say the majority are smooth, comfortable, dignified, relatively, relatively positive experiences in the context that it's a negative event.
As a medical practitioner in that space, what is it like for you if you do get sort of the situation where, potentially there is a family member that's present that doesn't agree with what is happening, wants to be there because they know it's going to happen, they want to be there for support, but doesn't necessarily agree with what is happening? How do you sort of manage a situation and an environment like that?
And that can be really challenging for sure. I do try to manage it before the event as much as possible. I'm a very big believer in transparency, in transparent conversations, in inviting in those who have different opinions, and really encouraging the patient themselves to facilitate that conversation, for them to speak up about what they're asking for and why. I think that that's important whenever it's possible. It's not always possible, of course. So I really try hard to make those conversations happen and to explore difference of opinion so we can get to a place of maybe respectful disagreement. Not always having that luxury. Sometimes things happen, or people voice opinions you didn't expect. I think in those moments that have happened, there are not a lot of them, thankfully. I think I flip into professional mode. I feel very strongly that I'm there to advocate for my patients. They are very vulnerable at that time. They're quite weak. They are very, very vulnerable. And it's part of my role to make sure that they are not coerced into this care, nor are they especially coerced out of this care, to be bullied by family or people who are meaning well, but maybe are not respecting, my patient's stated capable wish. So I tend to get protective in those moments and remind people that I know the rules and I know the laws and I know what's important, and I'm going to stand by them, and I won't let myself or my patients be bullied. Yeah.
And in your book, you share many different stories of your experiences. And as a reader, you really experience the humanity of the experience. And obviously, the humanity includes you. And what I found really fascinating is you sort of spoke about there being situations where potentially the family almost reflected, what your family would look like. Maybe there was a young mother that was sick and there were children sort of present. It's quite an emotional situation. You sort of discussed that, being human, it's sometimes hard to not project yourself into that situation. What is that kind of like for you in those experiences when it kind of, I think you sort of described in the book where it really hits home for you?
Yeah. So I think sometimes I'm human, right? So I'm not just a physician, I'm human. And for me, it's impossible not to project into different scenarios. I tend to spend a lot of my time when driving home thinking about what if that were, my, fill in the word, sibling, spouse, parent, child. And I allow myself to explore those ideas. Sometimes I can't help myself from doing that. And sometimes I do it on purpose. I think that I found some of those conversations with myself to be excruciating, to be honest. And I think the
Yeah.
ones that I didn't expect or that I couldn't really control, and I talk a little bit about that in the book, they're very emotional. They can be really difficult to come face to face with things you don't want to ever contemplate. But overall, I have found even those difficult moments, I found all of them to be really enriching to my life, because this work has allowed me to more explicitly reflect on all of my relationships, on my priorities in life, the things that bring meaning to me and what I might want in that particular circumstance. And I know a lot of that sounds cliche, but it's really proven true that by allowing myself to explore those potential situations, those scenarios, it's really put stuff in perspective for me. It's made me want to reach out to the people in my life who are important to me and who maybe I haven't told them that recently, to remind me to do that. And it's grounded me in a way that I find really, really helpful. So tough for sure, but overall really, really worth it. So I don't block those experiences. I let them happen. I think they happen for a reason, and I learn from them.
And unresolved emotion seems to sort of come up, whether it be sort of in the final weeks, final days, even, the final minutes of someone that has chosen to have assisted dying. What have you learned about being able to say sorry and or being able to forgive?
Yeah, so, so important. I see people, I do unfortunately see people who die without that closure, still not having spoken to that sibling they didn't speak to in 20 years. And I think it's not for me to judge that they deemed that was the best way for them to be. I'm sure there's a reason for it. I tried, I believe that was best for them. But I've seen just as much or more often, I've seen a sense of closure that people have been able to achieve, where they've kind of burst through that and reached out to someone or something or said something or found that final forgiveness. And it can be so important. It really gives a sense of peace for many people, and not just one person, but often not just two, often a whole ecology, a whole family or community. It can be really, really powerful. It's not always the right thing. I mean, I do need to trust my patients, but I do see a lot of value in that. So I do encourage that. And I think, like the same as you were just asking me, it reminds me that I need to do that too. It's not just to preach to others, right? We need to do that. There's such value in being honest and being vulnerable. And I think honesty and transparency are really, really important. I'm known to be quite direct with my colleagues and frank, and I think I value that. Yeah.
There was a story in your book that really hit home for me. I think it was a mother was sort of, I think you had administered the medication, and the mother sort of began to speak, and she kind of seemed to want to say these final words of potentially sort of saying, I'm sorry for, insert whatever. But because the drugs had been administered, she didn't necessarily get all the words out. And for me in that moment, it was interesting to see my perspective, because I was like, almost like, oh no, like these people are not going to get the closure that they need. But then I believe it was her daughter sort of came back and she just said like, I forgive you. I forgive you for everything. And for me, that was a beautiful lesson, that it just, at the end of the day, it truly doesn't matter about the specifics. It matters about the intention and for your own self being able to forgive.
Yeah, it was an incredibly powerful moment that really struck me. It was exactly that. It was a mother and a daughter, and clearly there had been a lot of dynamics over the years that I didn't understand, and I never would, come to understand. But the power in you could just see when the daughter, forgave her mother for whatever it was, and even if it was supposed to go both ways, it was so, you could see the change in her when she was able to do that. And I wasn't even sure whether she did that as a gift to her mother or she did it as a gift to herself. It was really such a powerful moment. Yeah.
And you share in the back of the book, actually, sort of some of the similarities and commonalities between the final words that are spoken. And I found that part really interesting, because a lot of it was based around love, but there was a large part that was almost based around like, let's go, like fire, like, let's just get this done.
Get on with it.
Yeah, let's get on with it. What is sort of like your perspective on, the difference between sort of people's final words?
Yeah, I was really happy to be able to include that. I think it's so interesting. I mean, it does
Mm.
kind of reflect a lot of the uniqueness. I mean, people are so
Yeah,
unique. Their perspectives are so different. And I love that it kind of reflects that, the variety of words that people use. Some are humorous, some are very serious, some are loving, some are, you know, but so I find it's really reflective of that. And I think it also shows there are a couple common themes. I mean, a number of people do mention love, but there is a real running sense of peace. The people that I work with who've
mm,
made this decision, the day of the assisted death, they are really sure. They're usually, if they're not sure, we don't go ahead. They're really kind of
right.
determined at that point, quite settled, at peace with their decision, really ready to move on. The family and loved ones who are gathered with them, that day is really hard for them. They are not
Mm,
settled at peace. They are grieving. They're grieving already, and they're going to be starting a new chapter of real intense grief, after the event. And that's something I learned after I started doing the work. I wasn't sure what it would be like, but I often have that sense of peace with the person themselves. And I do think that comes through with those last words as well. I continue to write down the unique ones, people that,
yeah.
yeah.
And as much as you're comfortable, Dr. Green, I would love to know more about your beliefs of, what happens after death, because you do mention in your book that for a lot of people, their beliefs provide a lot of comfort and a lot of this peace that you're talking about with sort of, passing from this life. What are your beliefs and how does that help the work that you do?
I think my beliefs honestly have shifted through the years. I
Mm,
relevant or not, I was raised in a traditionally Jewish home, and followed the rules and did all the things that were expected of me and never really questioned much. That changed when I, went off to university and started exploring life on my own and had other relationships. And I find myself at this stage, uh, for better or for worse, I certainly don't know what happens next.
mm,
I'm not a big believer in the afterlife. I'm
mm,
really open to it, and I kind of hope I'm wrong, to be honest. And
mm,
I'd love to be shown otherwise. I'm really open to that. But I think at this point in my life, my science brain has taken over, and I need some evidence. So I don't know. That's not a very poetic answer to you, but I don't have any answers. I really think that this life is it. For me, it puts more importance on living well and living meaningfully now in today, because I think for me, this is the most important time. I don't know if I'm wrong, and there may be more later. Hope so, but
mhm,
uh, I think that it doesn't inform my work in terms of uh, guiding people or advising them what's coming, but it does help me recognize the importance of finding meaning in life myself
mm,
and also the people I work with, and why, and my understanding why that's important to them. If they've lost meaning, if they've lost the things that gave them meaning,
mm.
that's important to recognize. I think that's really tragic, and it happens, and we need to recognize that as the important loss that it is.
And what would you say was or is the most important lesson you have learnt through this work? Is it, you have mentioned this element of being present and having meaning in your life. Is there anything else that you would add to that?
Hmm. I think those are probably the two most important. I think just
Mm,
the value of relationships, the connection we have with other people and it doesn't need to be grand gestures. I mean, I think we can find meaning in some of the simplest things.
mm,
People, have I guess people have taught me through this work that they find inner resources they never knew they had. Like, people will tell me when I first meet them, if I can't get out of bed, I'm done. Things
mm,
like that, like kind of blanket statements that I think they mean at that time. But then we get to a stage in their decline, and maybe they can't get out of bed, and they're not asking me to proceed, right? They find other resources and other meaningful, and a lot of that has to do with relationships. It could just be that they get to see the sunrise every day out their window, even though they can't do anything else. It could just be that they have some quiet time with a grandchild,
mm.
once a week that they maybe didn't value as much as they maybe could have or would have earlier. They find things of meaning. So I've even lost the question that you've asked me. I just, yeah, I think I think this work has given me the appreciation of the little things.
Mm. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And in moving forward in the work that you do, because it's very important to you, obviously you're a pioneer essentially in Canada in this work. Is there anything at this point in time that you would like to change about sort of the legalities and regulations of this work that you've experienced so far?
Oh, well, that could be a long list or a short
Yeah.
list. I guess I would start that by saying I think that most Canadians, myself included, are very proud of the changes that we have brought in. I think that the government has done a laudable job in taking those first steps. I really do. I think we shouldn't be so quick to criticize. I think
Yeah.
we made a massive change. It's been done well. It's been done carefully, and I applaud the government for doing that. And some of the more important tweaks did actually happen in 2021. There were some small amendments and some big amendments to our law. So I think a lot of the most pressing issues have been addressed. I think what I see right now is one of the more frustrating elements of what's happening is that we in Canada have a universal healthcare system where access to healthcare is supposed to be equitable amongst all. And of course, no system is truly that. And so we've always had issues with that. But I think that there's remaining some particular barriers that have been put in place for this particular care that are, there's no real reason why they should be there. There's no defensible reason why they should be there. There are some facilities that have just simply opted to decide that they're just not going to provide this care. That's unacceptable for patients who don't get to choose which hospital they're admitted to. They're asking for this care, and for them to be told they can't talk about this on the premises, they can't have this care on the premises. That this is taxpayer-funded facility. That's just unacceptable. So I'd like to see the access issue. I'd like to see somebody take responsibility. Is that federal government, provincial government? I don't know. There's politics involved. I'd like to see that issue, attended to for the benefit of the greater population. I'm not going to get into where the law could tweak itself. I think that's an academic presentation in and of itself. But, I'll go with overall, I think we've done really well.
Well, Dr. Green, thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for sharing your work and your story in your new book, Assisted. I truly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and to chat with others about this. I think it's important we have these conversations.
So on a final note, Dr. Green, I would love to ask you, what does it mean to you to be human?
Such a difficult question you ask.
It is.
I'm not sure that I have the answer for you, but I think one of the unique features of being human is our awareness of being alive. Actually, I think our relationships with each other and our ability to learn and to grow and to connect with each other and to find meaning in our lives. To have that luxury, instead of just surviving. I think these are luxuries, and I think these are things that make us human. Our interconnectedness makes us human, and our awareness of being here makes us human. And I think these are things that sustain us and make us fallible at the same time. So I'm not sure that I have a full answer, but I think it has to do with our awareness of ourselves.